Alright, let's talk about illuminated manuscripts. Okay, this is really where books begin that we think of as today, our idea of what a codex in a book means. They were decorated and illustrated handwritten books, and these began the time of the late Roman Empire, but we're going to really be focusing in that sort of like the medieval scriptorium kind of time period in which we think of monks beginning this big transition. They'll use things such as gold leaf, precious materials, silvers, gold leaf, inks that are very expensive. Usually the color blue is the most precious of all and most expensive because it was created using the stone of a lapis lazuli, which was only found in Afghanistan that had to be transported from thousands of miles away. So you can imagine its wealth, and the color blue then becomes a very symbolically special, sacred color. An illuminated manuscript could even require up to like the skins of over like 300 sheep, or the many intestines of cows, and to get that vellum and those parchment things. It's incredible. They were usually very small and very portable due to the fact that this is going to be a time after the Roman Empire collapses and there's a lot of warring. You've got a lot of stuff. It kind of makes me always think of Game of Thrones time when everybody's after everybody's stuff, and it's kind of like that, and you've got to be able to pick up your stuff and run. So here's a great example. Notice we're still into all capuscule, very large lettering, very square. But you can see it's coming out of the Greek alphabet, out of the Latin. And so usually illuminated manuscripts are a mixture of words and images. We're going to kind of be moving into this first form of just kind of like showing you that this is sort of how uncials come about, seeing a softening, sort of like, and these are like the half uncials, which allow a person to really write quickly and more fast. And if you are having to write all these books by hand, you can imagine that by creating this, you can now pick up speed. When we think of illuminated manuscripts, I always think of the Celtic tradition. So I would be familiar with the Celtic tradition. It's very abstract, complex symbols and shapes, very linear. Notice it's kind of flat and two-dimensional. Most of these books are going to be coming out of what we call scriptoriums. And that was a place located within the monastery. And within it you had specializations. You had the scritori. And the scritori is like the head guy, and yes, it would be a guy, who is in charge of designing the overall book and the layout, and he's in charge of everybody else, deciding where the words go, where the images go, etc. You would have the illuminator, and their job, of course, is they did the ornamentation and all the visual images to support the writing. You also had, of course, you would have the copista. And the copisti, his job, of course, is he does all of the writing. And so there are different parts of an illuminated manuscript. Usually a really important one was the colophon, which is the very ending of the book. And that usually, contain information and facts about how it's published. Sometimes it's missing, of course, because the ends usually get messed up. Here you can see Celtic illumination, though. And what it is two words I would know about the Celtic description and artistic way of doing it is the word interlaces, and that's this very interlacing, sort of like what we think of the Celtic knot work. And the lacertines, which you will see when it's a mixture of like animal legs that kind of turn into these Celtic knots and are very complicated and abstract and very complex. And so you get a little lacertine here, not too much. But also what I would know about the Celtic tradition is, wonderful thing is it's not very obvious here at first, but you can see it a little bit. They actually start to leave spaces in between words. We totally take this for granted, but if you're reading the ancient text, you've got to know where the word is. You've got to put the space in. And now we get them to kind of like, it helps with the reading, word in the space, next word. We just take it for granted, but boom, they're the ones who got it going for us. And here, of course, you can see, it's absolutely beautiful, but you can see this crazy interlacing and lacertining as well, because there's animals' legs and ears and tails that become this wild twist of a Celtic knot. Around this time, you've got Charlemagne. And Charlemagne becomes the head of the Holy Roman Empire. And he is really responsible for and given credit for trying to reform the alphabet and to standardize writing across the kingdom. And his empire stretches all across the Western Europe. And so this is also the time period in which we are going to start getting things like the difference between majuscules and minuscules, which will allow us to have like capital letters and lowercase letters. But here, this is probably the most famous of all, and I would write it down because it's the best example of Celtic art. And this is the Book of Kells. And of course, it's different biblical stories are encapsulated here. This is the most signature page of all. It's the Chi Rho, which is the first two letters of Christ's name. It's a mixture of beautiful interlacing lacertines, but also images within here. It's hard to see, but there's cat and mice here, and the imagery at that time was that the mice, which would eat the wafers in the church, was considered an example of evil and badness, whereas the cat, which kills the mice and protects the wafers, the Holy Communion food, is an example of good. Of course, us in our time of Tom and Jerry always kind of switch it around, but there it is. All right, and so imagery really develops, like you would know that these are the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all represented by animals, or the angel for Matthew, and then the ox and the lion and the eagle for the other, because that imagery appeared in their particular Gospels. But here you can see this beautiful, you can see the gold leaf being used, you can see the colors, the blue shows it's a precious manuscript. Oh my goodness gracious, just absolutely beautiful. And here it's a little bit easier to see some of the division between the letters and the words. And so in the Book of Kells, as I said before, imagery is important, but the text, of course, it's a way of making something beautiful but also educating. And remember, all books made completely and totally by hand. One of the interesting things I do want to add, that for those of you who like music, it's during this time, while the scribes are working in medieval monasteries, that they actually invent musical notation. So, not just books, but actual musical notation invented during this time period. Yay! So this is great. It doesn't excite us too much, but here's minuscules. It just shows you with these soft curving writing how you can really speed up somebody's handwriting fast and get more books produced. There is a small time period, especially remember as you have this cross-fertilization of all these different empires running into each other. A lot of stuff, because during the Romanesque period, you've got a lot of blending of nations. You're also going to have some Moorish influence and Arabic kind of influence from Islam up and through Spain. And so we also see this influence, the Celtic was very flat and two-dimensional. We're going to have an interest and re-interest in the Roman, very three-dimensional, and you can see it in this figure, the attempt to make it look three-dimensional and have depth. And so as you're saying, really we finally get the idea of the uncials, the softness, the majuscules, the minuscules, uppercase, lowercase, perfection. Yay, thank you. But it doesn't like it all changes at once. What you do get is you get to see an example. Here's the minuscule, kind of very elegant, very refined, but you still have that influence of the Celtic interlacing and lacertines. And then sometimes you have people just showing off. This is a commemorative labyrinth in which, oh my gosh, you start in the center of the top line and the inscription reads down and it reads left and it reads right. So it's a real labyrinth of all these different letter forms. It's really kind of a way to show off and to impress people as well. Ha ha ha. And why not? Why not do it when you can? All right. So also, as I was saying before, you've got influence from different places, and this is where we're going to get a little bit of that Spanish influence. And what's interesting, the very focus on the apocalypse from Spain and the dark red, bloody kind of colors and the orange and the heated looks to stuff. I really enjoy it. They were very, around this time period, as we're moving from literally to the year 1000, most people were reading the apocalypse and last judgment like the world's going to end. And so there was a real fascination, especially with that final book of the Bible. And so you see all these are like, this is like the final, you know, with death and the pale horse and all these fun things going on, and scales judging your life and judgment and evil in those final days of who goes and who doesn't. And so once again, you can just see the imagery is very important. Yay. But once again, I think probably the thing that the Celtic tradition really gives us is this idea of intense decoration and ornamentation, and the very difficultness and the amount of time and patience it is to create something that's to glorify God. Now we move into what's called the Gothic period, and the international Gothic style really takes hold. This is a time period towards the 1200s. The world didn't end, so what do? Well, we build some big giant cathedrals is what we do. And so verticalness becomes extremely important. The characters start getting elongated. The letters get very tall. There's really a vertical movement in all of the art. Cathedrals have to reach up to the heavens. And so if you look at the figure right here, he's like a tall, skinny, this is one tall drink of water right here is all I've got to say. And you can see the lettering itself, tall and slim. And I love it because, especially in this time period, as we're moving towards the Renaissance, things kind of get fun and interesting, and what you start seeing is an interest in stories and individualism, and you've got some really creepy, scary kind of figures coming on, and these weird half snail, half human, half owl, half whatever this is. So there's a little humor, there's a little individualism that's starting to come out. But mainly, once again, most of these mass-produced codexes, these books, the Book of Kells, the Book of Hours, which you will see soon, they are made by men who spend 10, 12, 16 hours a day at their desk doing their one job. If you are a copisti, you do nothing but write all day long. Illuminators illuminate. Those, you know, literally the scritori, you just yell at everybody and make sure everybody's doing their job. Okay? All right. And so one thing we do want to talk about is it's not like in the early Jewish tradition. It is not true. They did not completely take part in what was called anachronism. Anachronism is where you say absolutely, positively, religious-wise, there is no human and no animal imagery whatsoever. They really said to beware of it and to take heed and not to start worshiping icons. But it is found. It exists. I mean, here's Moses and the Ten Commandments. So it's when we get into Islam that they completely get away with it. But these early texts show, here's the Hebrew, here is the imagery that was done in their text. Unfortunately, many of these don't exist now. Even the Book of Kells was literally recovered from the side of the road in a mud puddle because somebody had just raised the church where it was, and the whole front piece of it, because it would have been bejeweled and beautiful, was ripped off the side. So many of the stuff, I mean, a lot of these stories begin because we don't have examples, but in the early Jewish tradition, they did use human and animal imagery. Now, the exact opposite for any Islamic art. If it's religious, what you have to depend upon is you depend upon the Word of God, calligraphy, geometric designs, arabesques, which is that very beautiful curvilinear soft shape. And so anachronism really does exist in Islamic religious art. You are not allowed to use the human form in which to do it. So that is very important. No human animal imagery, but do your geometrics, do your arabesques, do your calligraphy. Let the Word of God speak for itself. And of course, as you can see, amazing, beautiful color. And then it's very interesting to me, but a lot of folks always, immediately when they're thinking of India and Southeast Asia, they don't realize the huge influence of Islamic art and religion into there. And of course, when we think about the Taj Mahal, one of the most iconic Indian buildings in the world, is an Islamic mausoleum. And so here you will see that in India, their Islamic manuscripts very influenced by that Persian influence in which Islam is coming in and the Muslim tradition is being continued. And so I would go ahead. Book of Kells is a big one. The Book of Hours is a very generic kind of term, but the Book of Hours is a very important thing. These were small books. Of course, only the very wealthy and influential could own them, but kind of what they are small, I guess it's sort of like text today when people go into stores and they're like things that you read, inspirational texts each day, and there's psalms, there's poems, there's things of that nature. But just like any illuminated manuscript, the images, of course, represent and help educate with the words as well. And so the Limbourg brothers were very famous. They were very well liked by the king, had lots of good, unfortunately died from some terrible plague, we believe. They were victims. Many times the plague hit through. It wasn't just like it hit once. It kind of had a way of kicking back again. But the Limbourg brothers were most famous for these books of hours. And I love this one. It shows different times of the year. This one is January and February, so you see the peasant at work. And if you study it really closely and look, they're sitting here in front of the fire, and this dude has just whipped up his dress. And I'm like, he's showing the world everything. So it's good to look really hard at these pictures. You find out so much. But they're very educational. He included the horoscopes and astronomical signs and the movement of the planets and the stars within this Book of Hours. And of course, in February, you see the result of the very wealthy and the very erudite. And of course, these books would only be made for people who had the money and the materials and who could pay to get it done and such as that. So, yes, so I think that kind of takes us where we want to be. So the Book of Hours does a really good job of showing the Gothic approach and this interest in, renewed interest in science and astronomy and some other fun stuff. And playing, now we're getting a little bit more depth and perspective, and it's going to open the way up to get us to the upcoming Renaissance, which is going to be a real big impact for graphic artists and printing and all the other stuff. All right? Okay, good luck on the test.